What's the hardest part about being a man that nobody talks about? My daughter Ruthie died on a Wednesday in March. She was 6. A pickup truck ran a red light and hit the passenger side of my wife Lena's car while Ruthie was in her booster seat. Lena walked away with a broken collarbone and cuts on her face. Ruthie didn't walk away. I was at work when it happened. I'm a welder at a shipyard. My foreman came to the floor and said there was an emergency call. Lena's sister was on the phone. She told me to get to the hospital. She didn't tell me why. When I got there, Lena was on a bed behind a curtain with a neck brace on. I asked where Ruthie was. Nobody answered. A nurse walked me to a small room at the end of the hallway. A doctor told me Ruthie didn't survive the impact. He said it was immediate. He said she didn't feel anything. I don't remember what happened after that. I know at some point I was standing in the parking lot and it was dark, and Lena's brother-in-law was driving me home because I couldn't drive. The funeral was on Saturday. The church was full. People I hadn't seen in years showed up. Lena's entire family was there. My co-workers came. Parents from Ruthie's kindergarten class. Everyone came up to Lena. They hugged her. They held her. They whispered things to her and rubbed her back and brought her tissues. They told her she was strong. They told her they were there for her no matter what. I stood next to her the entire time. I was 3 feet away. I was wearing the suit I got married in because it was the only suit I owned. I was holding the program with Ruthie's picture on the front. Nobody said a word to me. Not one person walked up and asked how I was doing. Not one person put their hand on my shoulder. Not one person looked me in the eye and said, "I'm sorry for your loss." They looked through me like I was a coat rack standing next to the widow. Lena wasn't a widow. She was my wife. We lost the same child. But everyone treated it like Ruthie was only hers. After the funeral, people came to the house. They brought casseroles and rolls and fruit trays. They set everything up in the kitchen. They sat with Lena in the living room. Her mother stayed on one side. Her sister stayed on the other. Everyone surrounded Lena like a wall. I was in the kitchen putting foil on dishes and washing plates. Nobody came into the kitchen. I washed plates for 2 hours at my daughter's funeral reception because I didn't know what else to do, and nobody told me to stop. Nobody told me to sit down. Nobody brought me a plate. The next week, the cards came. Flowers for Lena. Books about grief with Lena's name written inside the cover. Lena's boss gave her 6 weeks off with pay. My foreman told me to take a few days. I went back to work on Monday because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. On the floor, nobody talked to me about Ruthie. One guy said, "Welcome back." That was it. Her friends started a meal train. Every other night, someone dropped off dinner with a note that said, "Thinking of you, Lena." My name was never on a single note. The meals were for Lena. The calls were for Lena. The grief was for Lena. A month after the funeral, I went to the hardware store on a Saturday morning. The cashier was a man about my age named Howard. He recognized me. He said, "You're Ruthie's dad from the kindergarten." I said yes. He put down the scanner and looked at me and said, "How are you holding up?" 4 words. I stood at that register with a bag of screws I didn't need, and Howard just waited. I finally said, "I'm getting through it." He nodded and said, "My brother lost his son 4 years ago. Nobody asked him either." Then he bagged my stuff and told me to come back anytime. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes after that. A stranger at a hardware store gave me more in 60 seconds than anyone in my life had given me in a month. I started counting, not the visitors, the days. I counted the days since anyone had asked me a single question about how I was feeling. Not how Lena was, how I was, me, the father. It hit 31 days, and I stopped counting because the number had already made its point. One evening, the phone rang, and it was Paolo. We'd been close since high school. He was at my wedding. He held Ruthie when she was 2 days old. He said, "Hey man, I've been meaning to call. Is Lena doing okay?" I held the phone against my ear, and I didn't answer right away. I finally said, "You could ask me that too." The line went quiet. Then he said, "I just figured you were more of a push-through-it guy." I know he didn't mean it the way it hit me, but that sentence landed on something raw. I said, "I'm not pushing through anything. I'm drowning, Paolo." He didn't say anything for a long time. The call ended awkward and short. At work, I picked up extra shifts, doubles, back to back. I just didn't want to go home and sit in a house where I didn't have a place. One afternoon, Zhao came by my station. He stood there for a second watching me work. I turned off the torch. He said, "You've been pulling doubles 3 weeks straight. You need to slow down." I said, "I don't have anywhere else to go." Zhao didn't look away. He said, "That's not a good answer." He stood near my station for another minute, like he was making sure I knew he was still there. That was the second time in a month someone had actually paused for me. First Howard, now Zhao. 2 men. That was the whole list. Every night after Lena fell asleep, I got up. I walked down the hall to Ruthie's room. I opened the door slow so it wouldn't creak. I sat on the floor next to her bed. Her shoes were still by the door. I couldn't move them. Her backpack was still on the hook. I couldn't touch it. The book we were reading together was still on the nightstand. The bookmark was still on page 34. It was a story about a rabbit who gets lost in the woods. Ruthie loved that rabbit. She used to make me do the voice. Every night I sat on that floor and I opened the book to page 34 and I read it. The same page. Over and over. I didn't turn to 35. I couldn't. Turning the page without her felt like leaving her behind. So I read the same words every night. Like if I just kept reading that page, she'd come back and sit in my lap and say, "Do the voice, Daddy-O." She called me Daddy-O. She heard it in a cartoon once and it stuck. I never corrected her. I would give everything I have to hear her say it one more time. One night, Lena came down the hall and stood in the doorway. She had her arms crossed. She said, "What are you doing in here?" I said, "Sitting with her." She looked around the room, at the shoes, at the backpack, at the book on my knee. Then she said, "You never talk about her." I said, "Nobody ever asks me to." She stood there for a few seconds. I could see something move across her face, something between surprise and guilt, but she didn't say anything. She turned and walked back down the hall. I heard the bedroom door close. I sat on that floor for another hour. Paolo called back 2 days later and said, "I'm sorry about what I said. Can I come over?" He did. He sat with me in the garage for 3 hours and just let me talk. He started showing up every Wednesday after that. He never came to the front door. He'd walk straight to the garage and pull up a folding chair. And every time he came, he brought a sandwich and 2 drinks. He'd set one in front of me and say, "This one's yours." My name wasn't on a card. There was no note. It was just food that someone brought for me. Just me. Not for the house. Not for Lena. For me. I'd sit there eating that sandwich and have to breathe through my nose because if I didn't, I was going to lose it over a bag of chips and a bottle of water. A man handing me a sandwich almost broke me every single Wednesday for a month. One evening, Paolo had just left and I came inside. Lena was at the counter. She said, "It's good you have someone to talk to." I set set my keys down and said, "It took 5 weeks for that to happen." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You had someone the first hour. I had no one for 5 weeks." Her face changed. She didn't say anything. She turned and walked into the living room where Fidelia was on the couch folding blankets. Sunday morning, I woke up early. I showered and put on a clean shirt. I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited. I was going to tell Lena everything. The funeral, the dishes, the cards with only her name, the 31 days, the floor in Ruthie's room, page 34. I'd practiced it in my head while I welded. I had it ready. Then I heard voices. Not just Lena. More than one. I stood up and walked to the kitchen doorway and looked around the corner. Mackenzie was at the table. Fidelia was next to her. Lena was across from them. They had a notebook open. Fidelia was writing in careful handwriting. There were papers spread out. A few printed pictures. A list of some kind. I said, "What's going on?" Mackenzie looked up first. She smiled in that way people smile when they're in the middle of something and you just walked in. She said, "We're planning a little memorial for Ruthie at the park where she used to play. Just something small for the family. The park where she used to play. The one with the big slide she was afraid of until she wasn't. The one where I pushed her on the swing so high she screamed and laughed at the same time." I said, "When?" Fidelia said, "Next Saturday. We've already talked to the family." Lena wanted to do something to honor her baby girl. I looked at Lena. She was looking down at the table. She didn't look back at me. I said, "When were you going to tell me?" Mackenzie said, "We're telling you now." She said it quick and light, like it was obvious, like I'd asked a silly question. Then Fidelia added, "It's for Lena's healing. She needs this." I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen. Lena's healing. Not our healing. Not the family's. For Lena's. Like Ruthie's death was something that happened to Lena, and the rest of us were just standing nearby when it went off. I sat down at the table and said, "I'd like to help plan this." Fidelia looked up and gave me a polite little smile, the kind you give someone when you're trying to be nice, but you've already made up your mind. She said, "That's sweet, but we've got it covered." That smile told me everything. I wasn't being forgotten. I was being edited out. Thursday, I found Lena in the bedroom folding laundry. I said, "I want to say something at the park on Saturday." She said, "I think Mackenzie is already going to speak, and my mom wrote something." I said, "I'm her father. I want to speak too." She said, "I'll ask them." My wife needed to ask her sister and her mother for permission for me to talk about my own daughter at my own daughter's memorial. Friday night, Mackenzie called. After Lena hung up, she came into the kitchen and said, "My mom is doing a reading. Mackenzie wrote a poem, and I picked a song. 3 items, 3 people." I waited for her to say my name. She didn't. I said, "Where am I on that list?" Her eyes moved to the floor. She said, "I forgot to ask. I'm sorry. I'll call her back." She didn't call Mackenzie back that night. I sat in Ruthie's room with a legal pad. I had been writing on it all week. Things only me and Ruthie shared. The way she called me Daddy-O. The shoes she put on the wrong feet every morning on purpose. The Sunday pancakes I made in animal shapes. The bike I taught her to ride in the driveway last summer. The night her fever wouldn't break and she said, "Sing me something, Daddy-O." 4 pages, front and back. Saturday morning I got up before the sun. I barely slept. Maybe 3 hours, broken up into pieces. I showered and stood in front of the closet and reached past the suit I got married in. I didn't want to wear that again. The last time I wore it, I washed dishes for 2 hours while people pretended I wasn't there. I pulled out a clean button-down shirt and a pair of dark pants. I got dressed and went to Ruthie's dresser. The top drawer was where Lena kept the little things. Hair clips, bracelets Ruthie got from birthday party favor bags, and the ribbon, the yellow one with the little daisies. Ruthie wore it every single day. She called it her sunshine ribbon. I used to tie it in her hair every morning because Lena said I was better at getting the bow even. I picked it up and held it in my hand for a long time. It was soft and thin, and it still had a crease in it from the last time it was tied. I folded it careful and put it in my front pocket. Then I picked up the 4 pages from the nightstand and put them in my back pocket. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and swollen. My hands were shaking, just a little. I didn't feel ready. I didn't feel strong, but I was going. About halfway to the park, Lena turned to me and said, "Mackenzie said the schedule is already set. Maybe you could say something after, if there's time." I kept my eyes on the road. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I could feel the pages in my back pocket pressing against the seat. I said, "If there's time." I said it flat, no question, no anger, just the words, repeated back like I was reading them off a wall. If there's time for a father to speak about his dead daughter. Lena reached over and put her hand on my arm. She said, "I know this is hard for you too." That word, too. Even in the kindest thing she'd said to me in 6 weeks, my grief came second. My pain was the also, the afterthought. Hard for Lena, and also, if there's room, hard for him too. We pulled into the park, and there were about 20 people already there. Fidelia had set up a little table under a tree with photos of Ruthie spread across the top. I walked toward it. Ruthie and Lena at the beach. Ruthie and Fidelia baking cookies. Ruthie with Mackenzie's kids at a birthday party. Ruthie and Lena at the zoo. Ruthie and Fidelia in the garden. Ruthie and Lena holding hands in the driveway. There was not one photo of me and my daughter. Not one. I reached into my pocket and felt the ribbon and the 4 pages, and I made a decision right there in the parking lot. I was not waiting for permission. I was not waiting for, if there's time. The memorial started 10 minutes later. Fidelia stood next to the table of photos and read what she'd written. About Saturday morning's baking cookies. About bedtime stories. She said, "Ruthie was our sweet girl. She was Lena's baby. She was the light of this family. She never said the word father. She never looked at me." Mackenzie went next. She read a poem about losing a niece. About watching her sister survive something no mother should ever have to survive. She said, "Lena, your courage inspires me every day." She read the last line. Ruthie was so loved by her mama and by all of us. Not one of them said my name. Not one of them said the word father. Then Lena stood up. She was shaking. She talked about the morning of the accident. She said, "I buckled Ruthie into her seat that morning. She was singing a song she learned at school. Something about a rainbow." Her voice cracked. She couldn't finish. Fidelia was on her feet in a second. Mackenzie came from the other side. The group closed around her like it always did. Lena pulled herself together. She sat back down. Mackenzie stepped forward and said, "Thank you all for coming. Ruthie was so loved. Let's take a moment of silence." That was it. 3 readings. 3 women. Not one mention of Ruthie's father. I looked across the group to the back where Paolo was leaning against a tree. He held my eyes and gave me one single nod. I stepped forward into the open space in front of the group. Mackenzie tilted her head and said quietly, "We're doing the moment of silence silence now. I said, I need to say something first. Then I heard a voice behind Mackenzie. Tylerson was standing there, the same guy who drove me home from the hospital the night Ruthie died. He stepped forward just enough to be seen and said, let him talk. Mackenzie turned her head. Fidelia looked up. Lena lifted her eyes from the ground. Tylerson didn't flinch. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the 4 pages. They were warm from being pressed against me all morning. The folds were soft from how many times I had opened and closed them during the week. I unfolded them in front of me. My hands were shaking bad enough that the paper made a small sound in the air. I looked up at the group. 20 faces looking back at me. Some confused, some patient, some uncomfortable. And I started reading. I started with the story about the day she was born. How the nurse put her on my chest at 2:47 in the morning and she grabbed my finger and didn't let go for 20 minutes. My voice came out rough and uneven and I had to stop after the first 2 sentences because my throat closed up. I blinked hard and kept going. I said, I became a father at 2:47 in the morning and everything I was before that stopped mattering. My voice leveled out after that. I told them about Sundays. How every Sunday morning I woke up early and made Ruthie pancakes shaped like animals. Bears and rabbits and one time a giraffe that looked more like a sock but she didn't care. She called them Daddy Pancakes. That was the name. Not pancakes. Daddy Pancakes. And if Lena made them, even if they were the same batter, same pan, same syrup, Ruthie would push the plate away and say, these aren't Daddy Pancakes. She wouldn't eat them. Every Sunday. That was ours. I looked up and said, she had a whole world with me that nobody in this park has mentioned today. The group was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels warm. The kind that feels like a room full of people who just realized they missed something big. I kept going. I told them about the bike. How I taught her to ride in the driveway last summer. I held the back of the seat and ran beside her for 3 days straight until my back was on fire. On the 4th day, she looked back at me and said, let go, Daddy-o. And I did. And she rode all the way to the end of the driveway by herself and turned around and came back with this look on her face like she'd just done the most amazing thing any human being had ever done. I told them about the night she got sick. She had a fever that wouldn't break, and Lena was working a late shift, and it was just me and Ruthie. I sat on the edge of her bed and held a cold cloth on her forehead for hours. She was hot and shaky, and her eyes were glassy, and she kept saying, sing me something, Daddy-o. I only knew one song, an old country song my own father used to sing when I was small. I don't even know all the words. I made up the rest. I sang it to her over and over until her fever came down around 4 in the morning, and she finally fell asleep with her hand on my arm. I said, I read to her every single night. We were on page 34 of a book about a rabbit who gets lost in the woods and finds his way home. We never got to find out if the rabbit made it. My voice cracked. It broke right in the middle of that last sentence like a branch that had been holding too much weight for too long. I stopped. I looked down at the pages and just stood there. The wind moved through the park and I could hear the chains on the swings creak, the same swings I used to push her on, and I pressed my lips together hard and breathed through my nose until I could see the words again. I folded the top page behind the others and kept going. But something changed when I looked up. I wasn't reading anymore. The pages were still in my hands, but I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at every face that had walked past me in a hallway, or sat on my couch, or stood in my kitchen for 6 weeks without seeing me. And I said what I came there to say. I said, I've been standing in rooms full of people for 6 weeks and not one person has said my name and Ruthie's name in the same sentence. Not one person has asked me what it feels like to lose her. Not one card had my name on it. Not one meal was for me. I washed dishes at my own daughter's funeral because nobody told me to stop. I let that sit. Then I said, I'm not saying Lena doesn't deserve every bit of love she's gotten. She does. But I am Ruthie's father. I carried her too. I just carried her differently. And nobody asked me how heavy she was. I reached into my front pocket and pulled out the yellow ribbon. I held it up so everyone could see it. The little daisies on it were faded from how many times Ruthie had worn it. I said, this was her favorite. She wore it every day. She called it her sunshine ribbon. She was wearing it the last time I dropped her off at school. I found it in the laundry basket the night she died. I've been carrying it in my pocket every day since. Nobody knew that because nobody asked. I folded the pages and put them back in my back pocket. I closed my hand around the ribbon and put it back in my front pocket where it had been every day for 6 weeks. The wind moved through the park. The chains on the swings creaked. Nobody spoke. Fidelia was crying with her hand over her mouth. Mackenzie was staring at the ground. Lena was looking at me the way you look at something you thought you knew, but are suddenly seeing for the first time. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then people started walking back to their cars. Lena rode home with Fidelia. I drove back alone. I parked in the driveway and sat there with the engine off. The ribbon was in my front pocket. The pages were in my back pocket. I went inside. I put the pages on the kitchen table and the ribbon on top of them. The house was empty. The book was still on the nightstand in Ruthie's room. The bookmark was still on page 34.